Even before I stepped into that mountain lodge, something felt wrong. The air seemed too still, too charged with an unease that crawled under my skin and refused to let go. The wind that swept through the pines sounded more like a low hiss than a comforting rustle, and a strange heaviness pressed against my chest. I told myself I was just exhausted from the long drive, but deep inside, I sensed an unspoken warning in that quiet darkness. My company had organized this weekend retreat to foster teamwork and rejuvenation. They promised crisp mountain air, hearty meals, and bonding activities around a roaring fireplace. I tried to ignore the chill that spread through my veins as I checked into my room. I was paired with a colleague, a quiet man who barely spoke throughout the day. He seemed distant, so I assumed he preferred solitude. We exchanged few words before we both turned in for the night. I drifted off with a faint hope that morning would bring normalcy. Sometime past midnight, I jerked awake, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was silent, but I couldn't shake the sense of not being alone. My colleague's bed lay empty, the sheets crumpled. I peered at the digital clock, 2:17 a.m. My mouth felt parched, my tongue thick and dry. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible voice drifting in from the corridor. Blood throbbed in my ears as I slid out of bed, my knees quivering. The corridor lamp flickered in an uneven rhythm, casting warped shadows along the walls. I stood there, listening. The whispering continued, a murmur that made cold sweat drip down my spine. The hair on my arms stood on end as I cracked the door open, only to find the hall empty. Yet those disembodied voices persisted, hushed but urgent, as if discussing secrets no outsider should hear. Suddenly, a slow, deliberate knocking rattled the door. My heart seized. With my breath stuck in my throat, I grabbed the handle. Before fear could paralyze me, I opened the door wide. Nothing greeted me except flickering lights and an oppressive hush. The whispering vanished in an instant, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. I stood there, trembling, unsure if I'd imagined the whole thing. My roommate was nowhere to be seen. Returning inside, I tried to steady my nerves. My hands shook, and my pulse still hammered in my ears. The sight of my colleague's empty bed only fueled the dread twisting in my gut. I felt eyes on me, but every time I spun around, the room was vacant. The air tasted stale, and my lungs struggled for each breath. No matter how many times I blinked, I couldn't dispel the feeling that something lingered just at the edge of my vision. When my colleague finally returned, his face was as pale as mine. He explained, in strained tones, that he'd gone to the kitchen for water but heard voices echoing off the tiled walls. He'd followed the sounds, only for them to stop whenever he rounded a corner. He insisted it could be old plumbing, or the wind through the vents, but his wide eyes and shaky voice told me he didn't believe his own words. Neither of us got real rest after that. In the morning, I tried to brush off the night's events, but every room in that lodge felt tense. The windows let in only a weak light, and I jumped at every small noise. More than once, I heard faint footsteps behind me when I was sure I was alone. At one point, a sudden pressure on my shoulder made me whirl around, but no one stood there. My breathing hitched, and a fresh wave of cold sweat slicked my forehead. Team-building exercises were a blur. My heart raced, and I scanned my coworkers' faces, desperate to see if anyone else sensed something lurking. Most appeared too busy or stressed to notice, but a few cast anxious glances at the hallways. Whispers circulated about flickering lights in vacant rooms, doors that rattled by themselves, and unsettling echoes. My fear ballooned with each casual mention, a leaden weight pressing harder on my chest. That afternoon, gray clouds rolled in early, shrouding the lodge in premature dusk. Lights flickered, and the corridors groaned with every step. A growing paranoia gripped me. The barely audible murmurs seemed to drift in and out of my peripheral hearing. It felt like the building itself breathed, alive with some hidden presence. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and my fingertips went numb from clutching my arms too tightly. By dinner time, my appetite had vanished. People made small talk, trying to keep the mood light, but the tension was palpable. My colleague and I locked eyes across the table, acknowledging without words that neither of us believed this was harmless. I felt a subtle tremor in my hands whenever I lifted my glass, as though my body refused to relax. The knowledge that night would inevitably come again weighed on me like a dark omen. On our final night, I roamed the corridor, determined to uncover whatever tormented my thoughts. My heart thudded like a drum in my chest, and sweat glued my shirt to my back. Faint whispers played tricks on my mind, as if calling my name from different directions. Every shadow stretched into a menacing shape, and the walls seemed to close in. My vision swam with shifting angles that I couldn't possibly explain. A sudden rush of air brushed past me, accompanied by a soft hiss that froze my blood. My muscles seized, and I stumbled against the wall, my fingertips scraping the rough paint. Then came the knocking, slow, methodical, and unrelenting, somewhere down the corridor. I forced my legs to move, though they felt weighed down by dread. When I found the door and flung it open, only a single flickering bulb illuminated a perfectly empty space. Yet the echo of that knocking pulsed in my skull. By morning, I couldn't bear another moment in that place. My colleague and I gathered our belongings and departed right after the final activity. The drive home was a blur of tense silence and repressed shudders. My knuckles turned white around the steering wheel, and my breath came in uneven bursts. Even then, I questioned whether I'd allowed my imagination to transform simple creaks into something monstrous. Now, days later, I still can't escape the memory. At night, in my quiet apartment, I sometimes hear a distant knock or a whisper so soft it could be my own breath. I switch on every light, reminding myself I'm safe, but that cold knot in my stomach refuses to dissolve. Part of me wonders if something followed me from that lodge, waiting in the shadows to remind me that some doors, once opened, never truly close. The thought alone sends a chill through my body, and I'm left uncertain whether my mind is playing tricks, or if I've stumbled onto a truth I was never meant to know. I knew something was deeply wrong the first time I heard that faint scraping against the corridor's carpet. It was well past midnight in a building rumored to be quiet as a tomb. Yet the footsteps came, a slow shuffle that seemed to drag across the floor. They paused right outside my door, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. Then, just as suddenly, the sound vanished into the hush. That was my first night here, and every night since, the quiet has felt like an oppressive weight, crushing me under the question of whether I should have ever moved in at all. I remember my excitement when I signed the lease. The apartment building was nestled in a calm neighborhood, with neatly trimmed lawns and a lobby that smelled of fresh paint. At first glance, everything seemed perfect, a refuge from my hectic life. The initial days passed without incident, and I enjoyed the soft morning light that streamed through the blinds, illuminating dust motes in a gentle haze. But at dusk, the hallway felt different. The overhead lights buzzed with a low hum, barely bright enough to guide me to my door. That was the first time I noticed the corridor's walls looked strangely narrow at night, as though closing in on me with each passing hour. On the fifth night, I was jarred awake by what sounded like a soft drag against the carpet. My chest tightened, and cold sweat trickled down my temples. I tried to focus on the noise, which seemed to come from somewhere just outside my door. The footstep, or shuffle, repeated. My heart hammered so fiercely I could hear blood rushing through my ears. I reached for my phone, its screen's glow the only source of reassurance in that suffocating darkness. The building's caretaker had mentioned nothing about nightly patrols, nor had he warned about neighbors wandering at odd hours. Yet there it was, that maddening gliding step in the corridor, stopping every few seconds, leaving me gasping in bed, paralyzed by dread. When I confronted the building manager about it the next morning, he shrugged and said there were no reports of anyone entering the corridor after midnight. He suggested it might be the pipes, or perhaps my imagination. Though he tried to sound helpful, his tone indicated he didn't believe a word. I left that conversation with a prickly sensation at the back of my neck, as if I'd just been dismissed like a nervous child. Back in my apartment, the daylight did little to dispel the memories of the previous night. Every thump or creak in the old structure set my nerves on edge. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. A week passed, and the noises grew bolder, always starting around 3 a.m. The faint click and drag, would travel down the hallway with a menacing patience. Some nights, the footsteps circled around, though I couldn't tell which direction they came from, leaving me sitting upright in bed, skin crawling with goosebumps. Every muscle in my body tensed in anticipation of something, anything, happening. Yet when I'd fling open the door, the corridor stretched out vacant and dim, the overhead lights flickering like tired eyes. The oppressive silence that followed made my throat close up, as if I could no longer trust my own senses. Desperation drove me to a new tactic. I decided to sit in my living room, lights off, from midnight until dawn, determined to catch whoever was out there. My nerves buzzed so intensely I could barely keep my hands from shaking. My mouth was dry, and my heart thudded with the steady insistence of a distant drum. At around 2:30, the temperature dropped noticeably. A chill wind, not from the vents or the windows, seemed to crawl across the floor and wrap itself around my ankles. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself not to move, not to make a sound. Minutes later, I heard the first step. Shuff, then silence. Shuff, then silence again. Those footsteps felt closer than ever, inching toward my front door. My breath came in quick, ragged gasps, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. The carpets in the building were thick, but the dragging sound was unmistakable, as though something heavy was being lugged along. Each drawn-out scrape sent a tremor through my chest. I stared at the slim line of light under the door, half expecting to see a pair of feet appear. Then the footsteps stopped exactly in front of my door. No knock came, no whisper, just an excruciating stillness that pressed against my eardrums. I must have held my breath for a full minute, certain that any sound from me would trigger some unimaginable horror. Suddenly, a cold draft passed under the door, as if someone on the other side had breathed ice into the hallway. My whole body began to tremble. I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't alone. Something stood there, blocking the faint light from the hallway, silent and watching. I couldn't will myself to reach for the doorknob. I just sat, eyes locked on that crack of light. A numbness spread through my limbs, and my stomach churned. Eventually, the presence receded. The The corridor light reappeared under the door, the footsteps fading into nothingness. Left with the sound of my own heartbeat throbbing in my ears, I wondered if I'd finally slipped into madness. In the days that followed, every movement in my apartment felt scrutinized, as though unseen eyes tracked me from the corners. The mirrors in my bathroom seemed wrong, slightly warped. Or perhaps my reflection was the one that had changed. When the caretaker casually mentioned a previous tenant who left abruptly but didn't give details, my skin crawled. My mind swirled with questions. Did they hear the same footsteps? Was I living through the same ordeal that drove someone else away? Every rustle of curtains and flicker of light felt charged with a threat I couldn't name. I've contemplated leaving more times than I can count. Each night, I pack a few essentials in a bag, telling myself I'll leave at sunrise. But when dawn comes, the rational part of my brain insists I'm overreacting. I start doubting everything. Maybe it was just the stress of moving. Maybe the footsteps were mere creaks of an old building settling. Yet the memory of that freezing air against my face keeps me tethered to a constant dread, like I'm teetering on a precipice. Last night, I finally decided to test my resolve. I stood by the front door in total darkness again, heart hammering, ready to fling it open the instant I heard that telltale shuffle. Sure enough, the steps came, each drawn-out drag sounding more deliberate, more eager. I clenched the doorknob, breath shaky, sweat dripping down my brow, and waited until the footsteps paused on the other side. In one swift motion, I yanked the door open, my pulse roaring in my ears. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, electric. A chill radiated from the spot just a few feet away, as if some invisible force occupied that space. My instincts screamed that something was looking right at me, something intangible, yet horrifically present. I can't say what was there. I only know it didn't leave when I opened the door. Even after I slammed it shut, I felt that charged energy lingering. Now, as I write these words, I'm torn between packing up and leaving forever, or staying to confront whatever haunts this place. But each night, the air grows colder, and those footsteps come closer. I wonder if I'm the next to abandon this apartment in the dead of night, or if I'll stay until the dread consumes me piece by piece. One thing's certain. The unease follows me everywhere. Even the daylight seems gray and lifeless. I question my sanity, my senses, and whether this apartment chose me rather than the other way around. And no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that those dragging footsteps aren't finished with me yet. I felt a chill run the length of my spine the moment I stepped onto the weather-beaten concrete ledge, as if the air itself sensed my intrusion. The Represa had always been a place of solace for me, a refuge where the early morning fog gently embraced the water, and the lull of small waves brought me peace. But that late afternoon, the entire setting felt wrong, as though a creeping darkness had settled over every rusted railing and ripple in the lake. I should have known better than to come at dusk, yet curiosity about the water's level beckoned me here. Now the very atmosphere seemed to rasp with a low, vibrating dread. I walked along the dilapidated walkway, my boots scuffing the peeling concrete. The wind carried a scent I can only describe as stale, a bitter tang that made my eyes prickle. The sky was caught between daylight and evening, that uneasy hour when shadows grow fangs. As I approached the Mirante, something about the silence made my heartbeat kick into a frantic pace. My breath caught in my throat when I first noticed it. A tall, dark figure standing at the edge, head tilted down toward the lake. I told myself it had to be someone enjoying the view or waiting for the sunset. But the figure didn't budge an inch. Even against the dying light, it appeared unnaturally still. I remember the odd flicker of doubt in my mind, some primal sense warning me to keep my distance. I advanced a step, then paused. The figure's entire form seemed wrapped in shadow, but not in the normal way a person would be. It looked like the last embers of daylight bent around it, failing to illuminate any feature. My pulse hammered in my ears, a heavy thump that nearly drowned out the gentle hiss of the wind across the water's surface. I tried to call out, but the words died on my tongue. Instead, I coughed nervously, clearing my throat, hoping to make my presence known in a subtle way. The figure offered no reaction, every second stretched into a tense eternity, my nails digging into my palms as anxiety built inside my chest. Suddenly, as if guided by some silent signal, it turned to face me. Where a face should be, there was only a shifting darkness, a void that seemed to drink in the half-light. My stomach lurched, and my knees felt as though they might buckle at any second. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so fiercely I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. Sweat broke across my forehead, and my vision swam. In that instant, the figure vanished, evaporating as if it had been swallowed by the growing shadows. My nerves were wound so tight that I could hardly breathe. Every hair on my arm stood on end, and a suffocating sense of dread rooted me to the spot. For a moment, I questioned whether I was losing my mind. Perhaps the glare of the setting sun had created a trick of the light. Yet my heart refused to settle, each beat reminding me how real the encounter felt. My mouth was dry, and when I finally managed to swallow, it felt like I was gulping razor blades. I forced myself to scan the concrete walkway, praying I'd see a human outline or hear footsteps receding. There was nothing but the rustle of the wind and the distant lap of water against the shore. I lingered there longer than I should have, drawing in shaky breaths and trying to convince myself to leave. Yet a stubborn part of me needed confirmation, some proof that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I inched closer to the edge, leaning over the railing to inspect the Mirante's base. The surface was cold and slick, covered with algae stains and unidentifiable blotches. No footprints, no sign that anyone else had been there. As the sky deepened into a bruised palette of purples and blacks, a dreadful fascination kept me tethered to that spot. I felt watched, though by what or whom I couldn't say. Every rustle of leaves or distant splash in the water made me jerk around, my pulse leaping into my throat. I had no idea if I was truly alone. At one point, I thought I heard a faint whisper carried on the breeze. I strained my ears, but the sound was so slight, it might have been my own breath. I told myself it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the concrete. Still, my hands shook, and I could feel goosebumps rising along my arms, despite the humid evening air. That paranoid thought emerged. Perhaps the figure was crouched behind me, waiting for the perfect moment to appear again. I gripped the guardrail, knuckles white, forcing myself to steady my trembling. My lungs ached as I tried to keep my breathing quiet, half convinced that any sound I made would provoke another manifestation. I imagined that void-like face suddenly pressing against mine, staring without eyes, draining the warmth from my body. A spasm of panic flared in my gut. My mental resolve started to fray. Vivid memories surfaced of strange stories told by other fishermen, tales of unsettling shapes glimpsed at dawn, or eerie lights dancing along the shoreline. I'd always dismissed such legends as exaggerations, born from lonely nights and anxious minds. Now, I found myself weighed down by the dread that those stories might hold truth. The boundary between the real and the impossible felt dangerously thin. I decided I couldn't bear it anymore. My own survival instinct roared to life, telling me to get the hell out. I gathered enough courage to turn my back on the lake and start walking. My steps were uneven, as though my legs were fighting against some invisible weight, trying to drag me back. The gravel path near the Mirante crunched under my boots, each crack and shift of stones setting my nerves on edge. I refused to look over my shoulder, terrified that I might see that faceless shape right behind me. Once I reached my car, I nearly dropped the keys from my trembling fingers. My breath came in ragged spurts, and my heart refused to calm down. I slid into the driver's seat, hands clammy on the steering wheel, and forced the engine to start. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting something to appear in the dim back seat. The tension in my body was so intense that I felt sick to my stomach. I made it home in a daze, but the dread accompanied me inside. Every dark corner in my house seemed suspect. Every faint creak made me freeze. I locked doors and windows, heart still galloping, struggling to reassure myself that the figure couldn't possibly follow me here. Yet, deep inside, I sensed that what I encountered at the lake wasn't confined to a single place. It was the kind of presence that could worm into your mind, intensify your fears, and poison your sense of safety. All night, I imagined that nameless shadow, standing in the corners of my vision, waiting for me to slip into sleep. The darkness in my bedroom felt thicker, more oppressive. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless silhouette, felt its silent scrutiny, and relived that moment of paralyzing shock. When morning finally arrived, the sunlight was a weak comfort against the memory still haunting me. I haven't gone back to the Represa since that day. Even now, whenever I think of the lake, a chill creeps through my bones, reminding me of that impossible shape with its featureless void. I'm not sure if it was ever truly there, or if my mind, weary and unsettled, conjured something from the creeping twilight. What I do know is that I can't banish the terror it awakened. It lingers with me, a silent witness to the darkness that can lurk in plain sight. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if that figure stands by my bedside, waiting for me to believe it was all just a nightmare.